Okay, so I've hit the record button, so let's get started. And just to go back to housekeeping, as I said earlier, let's leave those questions until the back end. And please, by all means, put them in the chat if you want to as we go along, and we'll get to them later. There are too many people on the call to effectively kind of start and stop for individuals and to focus on one particular area, one particular question. So today is the first of two sessions on behaviors and motivation. And before I even begin, let me point out that I have no qualifications in psychiatry or psychology, and any views expressed in this are purely my own. So today is, in the first session, I'm going to talk specifically about your brain, our brain, and the forces acting on and competing to motivate us to behave in the way that we do. And by understanding, hopefully, understanding how our brain works, this will better allow us to substitute, to prioritize what we decide is most important to us, rather than being controlled by other influences, both external and the internal ones, like our impulses, our urges, our wants and needs, etc. So next week in the webinar, I'm going to be looking at models for helping us to motivate others. So this is more focused on work and career and in our role. Today is going to talk mostly about, in a very broad sense, about the psychology, which is, interestingly enough, psychology, the definition of it is the scientific study of the mind and behavior. So we are going to look at a view, a certain view, one of many, many views of the mind and behaviors that come from that. So remember, there's many ways to skin a cat. I'm not going to talk about it in great depth. I'm going to use one model that I quite like, which is kind of this helicopter view model that allows us to look down at motivation and behaviors. And all I'm trying to do is use this explanation to let us understand how it all works. But the main kind of thing I want to come out of this is that we understand later on what we can do to help ourselves, to better motivate ourselves so that we have better behaviors. So let me begin to share the screen. So give me a second. And what I will do when I'm sharing the screen is there's Google Hangout puts my image over here, which I hate with that. So I'm going to turn off my screen while I do that. So sorry, you won't see me through the thing. Let me open a window now. Okay, motivation, and let me share this one. So hopefully in a second, you shall see behaviors and motivations. Okay, I'm hoping you got that now. Let me go back to it. Okay, I'm in a better place. So, yeah, so 2 weeks, and this is week one. The first thing I want to do is give a simple explanation of what behaviors are, firstly, and then what motivation is. So behaviors, the way in which a person behaves in response to a particular situation or stimulus. So one thing that I can take from those two words, situation or stimulus, is that it starts to hint at intrinsic and extrinsic influences. So things that come from inside us, like an urge to have a banana, versus something that's coming from outside us, like it's raining today. And so, so all of the time, these both internal influences and external within our own mind and external influences are having an effect on our behavior, which is the way a person behaves in response to a particular situation or stimulus. Another way is the way in one acts or conducts oneself. And this is especially towards others. And they're very much moment to moment. Is that when you think about that, we are enacting one or two behaviors or a small number of behaviors at any one time. And what we do next, our next behavior changes from absolutely moment to moment. I won't even say second to second. It's probably much smaller than that. And what we want to do on our side, from the Sprint Living side, is we want to understand how to better manage, how to better control this moment to moment behavior. And the first step in trying to control something is that you kind of have to understand it. And so, yeah, so what we're trying to do then is to focus on that. So let's talk about motivation for a second. Motivation is the brain processes that energize and direct the behaviors. So this is standing behind the behaviors. We have our motivation, which is the processes, or this, the processor in a computer that energize and direct behaviors. These are the CPU for making the decisions about what behaviors happen next. And in B here, the process that initiates, guides, and maintains goal-oriented behaviors. So again, the word process here. So motivation stands behind behavior and takes all the power of the brain and all the different influences from the different parts of the brain, which we're going to come to in a second, and basically is the kind of computer that then decides what to do next. Our motivation is the thing that says to us, this is what I'm going to do next. This is the next behavior that I'm going to carry out. Okay, simple explanation, behaviors and motivations. Now, one thing, I'm going to come in from left field with this one. I'm just going to make a mention here again, just to make sure it's clear. Everything I'm going to talk about today is going to be focused on intrinsic motivation, on intrinsic influences. And I've written down here a couple of explanations. Intrinsic, one explanation of it. Intrinsic motivation is when you engage in behavior because you find it rewarding internally. If you have an ice cream, you feel satisfied with that, from that. If you do some activity, you feel internally satisfied from that. So it's internally rewarding because you find it rewarding. You're performing an activity for its own sake rather than an external, rather than the desire of some external reward. The behavior itself is its own reward. When you sit down and play with your child, you feel good about it. It's up to you. And extrinsic motivation is something we're going to focus on a small bit more next week. Involves completing a task or exhibiting a behavior because of outside causes, outside rewards, such as avoiding punishment or receiving a reward. So your boss says to you, you're getting a big bonus. That gives you extrinsic motivation. It's coming from the outside. A big tidal wave is coming towards you. External motivation to run away up as high as you can. Okay. So, and then with that, I also just want to mention that there are also both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and there are also intrinsic and extrinsic influences on our motivation as well. Just as a kind of a side point, just to kind of muddy the waters a small bit there. So let me move on. Okay, then this is another left field thing before I get into the kind of core topic, which is basically, this is called the Combi model for motivation. And what this slide is really saying is, look, motivation is hugely important, both intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. But the bottom line is that there are a number of other things that are important as well. We have to have, and this Combi model talks about these three here as being the components of any behavior. So these three, on the right-hand side, we have the person and the behavior. On the left-hand side, we've got the capability, the motivation, and opportunity. Capability, psychological and physically being able to do something. The ability to do it. Opportunity, have the social, the physical opportunity for the behavior, to be able to do it. And the motivation then, the want or need to carry out the behavior more than other competing behavior. So motivation is always judging A against B, X against Y. There are many, many things that are coming up in our head to say, this is the next thing that I want to do, my next behavior. And the motivation is your computer then that prioritizes one over the other. The other interesting thing as well is that, so we're going to focus mostly on motivation today. So we're not going to talk about ability. We're not going to talk about opportunity. I just wanted to point out that while motivation is absolutely core, there are other things as well. And I'll give you an example. I'm a very motivated person. I do a tiny bit of kite surfing, which I'm really crap at. But the bottom line is that every year I get out to go kite surfing about once or twice. And the reason is not because I'm not motivated, because I do think about it a lot. The reason is because I live far away from the coast. So opportunity. So opportunity stops me from improving both my capability, even though I've got motivation. So they all three have an influence on each other. They're like a system and they're dynamic. So if you have the motivation to do something and the opportunity, you will go and do it. That will improve your capability, which will then improve your motivation as well. So all the time, each of those three are working on each other. So they interact. And one of the things is that any intervention, any change that you make must influence one of these three in order to deliver a change in behavior. Okay. And this Combi model is only one of many models. I was reading last night about a gentleman called BJ Fogg. I do a lot of reading in the area of habits, and he talks about habit behavioral model, and he talks about motivation, capability, and the trigger. He doesn't talk about opportunity in the same way. So those are his three views on how to change a behavior, while the Combi talks about capability, motivation, and opportunity. And you'll see this an awful lot in psychological models, especially next week in terms of when we talk about career and work, is that what one expert says are the core things that influence behaviors or motivation. Another expert will say, no, these are different ones, are two of the three, and they will interject one of their own, etc., etc. So the model slightly changed, and that's why I wanted to show Combi. It's a good model, but it is not the only model out there. BJ Fogg has a slightly different take on it for different things. But they both talk about how do we change behaviors. BJ Fogg does focus on habits. So the next thing I want to talk about is how do we influence our behaviors? And I'm going to specifically talk about our brains, as I said, intrinsic, and the forces acting on and competing to motivate us. So if we take motivation, and we want to know what are the different elements that have an influence on our motivation to behave then in the way that we do. And so the hope is that by understanding all the competing elements that improve, that have an influence on motivation, by understanding how our brain works, will better allow us to substitute and prioritize what we decide is the most important one. And there are things I'm going to go through: impulses, urges, wants and needs, etc., etc. Okay. So next slide. So let's start at the very beginning: impulses and inhibitions. Impulses, they're front and center all the time. When you think about it, there is nothing more that is closer to our behavior. And what I mean is this: if you're out in the wild somewhere in a country that has snakes, and you are next thing there is a snake in front of you, you will have a reaction straight away. You will have an impulse to withdraw your hand or to move away from that. That impulse will be very, very strong. So if you were thinking about going for a pizza afterwards or changing your whole life or getting a new job, everything else is lost when it comes to impulses and inhibitions. They're front and center. If you looked at the sun, they are the closest planet to the sun. So they have the greatest bearing on motivation. And because they have the greatest bearing on motivation, they have the greatest bearing on behaviors. Impulses compel us. They activate an immediate action. Inhibitions oppose, and they suppress immediate action. So the two opposing sides of it, and they're very low level. They're very animalistic. They're very core to not just us, but to other animals as well. And, they're not part of our conscious self. They are very much in our, what would you say? What would be the words? Historical view, going back to the beginning of humanity. Low level and animalistic. Now, it's worth mentioning something called urges. Urges are kind of a subset of impulses and inhibitions. And urges are a subjective experience of impulses that do not immediately result in responses. So a simple one is, I have the urge to go to the toilet. I very badly need to go to the toilet. It's not something like taking your hand away from a snake that you're going to do right at that moment, which is an impulse. But it is very close. It's a subjective experience of impulses that do not immediately result in responses. Okay? So a couple of examples of impulses. For a smoker, the urge to just smoke before they even know it. They've taken out a cigarette. Fight or flight response, the desire to run away when threatened. And I always remember as kids, someone would say, no, it's a simple one. We would dare ourselves to put our hands into a hole in the wall, and take our hands out. We would always have, once we put it in, to have the impulse or even the urge, you could say, to take our hands out of the hole. And two different areas, if we want to again break impulses and inhibitions down, we have learned and unlearned stimulus associations. In other words, our instincts are unlearned. The instinct to take your hand away from a snake is unlearned. And then at the same time, or to take a hand out of that dark hole would be an instinct for us. A habit is a learned stimulus association. And it's worth noting that 40% of our daily behavior is habitual. So in other words, almost half the time, and some of the reading I've done said even more, 50, 60% is subconscious, is that we are running on automatic. So half of the time we're in habit. We're doing things as part of a habit. So again, these are subsets, are parts of our impulses and inhibitions. And that's why, habit training changes the strength of these stimulus impulse associations. In other words, the whole secret of a habit is to stop us from going with our impulses. So again, instinct is an unlearned association, and a habit is a learned association. Biting your nails as a kid, and we all have positive habits. Going for exercise every day, etc., is a very positive one. So if we look at this slide now, we can see that, right, motivation is on the right-hand side, leading to behavior. What are the things that influence those? Impulses and inhibitions, we put them right there, very, very close to the right-hand side. And the next one that I want to talk about are our wants and needs. These are, how do I explain wants and needs? So, 1 second now. Okay. So, pleasure, satisfaction, relief. These are the kind of the words that describe it. So it's a strength of feeling of anticipated pleasure, and pleasure or satisfaction. This is a want, or a strength of feeling of anticipated relief from, or avoidance of some sort of mental or physical discomfort. And this is what a need is. And they're also called motives. Motives, feelings of desire, wants, and needs for something. And one way of looking at it is that they are this feeling of desire coming from our imagined future. If I do this, the outcome will be that I will have satisfaction, or I will have relief. So these desires, these motives, wants and needs, are really, really strong within us. And they're just standing right behind impulses and inhibitions. So nothing is going to block an impulse and inhibitions. With the snake, absolutely we'll take our hand away. If we fall in the water, absolutely we will swim to shore. We won't think about trying to make a pizza. The first thing with impulses and inhibitions is how immediate they are and how strongly they influence motivation. The next one in the line, the next biggest influencer, are the wants and needs: pleasure, satisfaction, relief. And just, I mean, let's look at a couple of examples. Once the desire to go and have dinner tonight, then the desire to have a drink after work. When you're ill, the need to have an aspirin or a paracetamol, the desire to have a bath or to have a night in, something like this. These are all wants and needs. They will bring you pleasure and satisfaction and relief. And this is what wants and needs and the motives are all about. Now, there are two things to consider when we're thinking about this. The first one is the two influencers. One is the identity, the self. So I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but our identity, our belief about ourselves is a very strong influencer on our wants and needs. If you say, I am a person who doesn't drink alcohol, then you will not drink your alcohol. If you say, if you imagine or believe that you're a person who is thrifty, who doesn't spend an awful lot of money, is very safe with their money, then you will not make extravagant purchases. So this belief and this image we have of ourselves and the feeling about them, I am this, I am that. And it's a major part of our motives. So a major influence on our wants and needs. And one of the things that, I was doing some research on recently is that this ability to change your identity has a huge influence on many different parts of many of the things that we're going to talk about today. We haven't come to them yet. Our values, our beliefs, our future plans, our wants and needs. If we could change our identity, what we believe about ourselves, then this would affect all those three areas. The second thing beyond identity and self that I want to talk about is this idea of mimicry. Just 1 second. Excuse me, just needed a drink. Humans are intensely social animals. And the research suggests mimicry is a critical part of this human social interaction. It's ubiquitous, and it often occurs without the awareness of the person or the person being mimicked. So we're talking about non-conscious mimicry, this idea of verbal, facial, emotional, behavioral mimicry. And I don't need to go into great detail on it. I think we all understand this, that we do mimic other people. When we're in a group of people, we become like them. When we're at work, we become like that group at work. One-to-one relationships. How many times have we changed or evolved ourselves or mimicked our partner or someone that we admired when we were with them? So two things that are kind of subsets that are huge influencer on our wants and needs on our identity and self, and the idea of mimicry. Okay, so let's talk about values and beliefs now. So you can see here now, I put impulses and ambitions closest to motivation. Wants and needs, if it was out of 100, impulses would be up there in the 90s to 100 in terms of the amount of influence. Wants and needs would be down in the 70s, I'm making this up, in terms of the influence it has on our motivation. Values and beliefs are the next thing on the list. And now we're now getting quite far away from motivation, from the influences on motivation. So two things really, values and beliefs, but I also want to talk about another word called imperatives. So let's look at beliefs first. Beliefs, an acceptance that something exists or is true, especially one without proof. And values, the regard that something is held to deserve, the importance of something, the worth of it, the usefulness of something. And I always use the word valuable, is that it's important to us. And belief for me is something that you believe is true, even if you can't categorically say that this is 100% true, that you know it for a fact. A fact is slightly different. A belief is close to a fact really for you. But beliefs change from person to person. Facts should not. So they're also called evaluations, beliefs that involve a judgment of a degree of positive or negative value. In other words, something is good or bad, right or wrong, something is harmful or beneficial. And again, this is to you. Something that's good for you might be bad for someone else. Something that's right for you might be wrong for someone else, harmful or beneficial. So, an example of a value or belief is that I believe in a deity, I believe in a God, and I will go to church on Sunday. And what's important about this is that when we look at wants and needs and impulses and ambitions, they're really, really close to motivation. Whereas values and beliefs, it's only important in terms of motivation if you enact that within your motives, leading to motivation, within your wants and needs. So the idea that, I want to give up smoking, I will give up smoking, this idea that this is a value or a belief that you're going to do, it then inserts itself into wants and needs, which then inserts itself into the impulses and inhibitions, which means that you then have the motivation to give up smoking. So the one thing I want to talk about is this idea of imperatives, and it's kind of another left field. Imperatives are values specifically related to actions. So if you could put the word I should and I ought to, then they're more imperatives. I should stop drinking at the weekend. I should get more exercise. So all the time, our values and beliefs and these imperatives, we are getting new information about them, about what our values are, updating our values and our beliefs. And this is something that we in Sprint Living actually put a lot of focus on. Number one is kind of putting a line in the sand in terms of what are the important values and beliefs that we have, and then also trying to improve them. And that going into that, what the word improvement, in depth into what the word improvement means, I'm going to leave that for now. But we do focus on values and beliefs, not trying to say what they are, but trying to get you to give some thought to them so that you can actually, and one of the reasons why we want you to give some thought to them is because the more time you're giving thought to them, the more they influence our motivation. And if we have good values and beliefs, and I don't know what that word good means, as we give them more thought, we should effectively improve them. And as we improve them, we should want them to motivate or be part of motivation more and more. We do want them to influence our behaviors. And that's what we work on with Sprint Living. So while wants and needs and impulses and inhibitions are quite close to motivation, values and beliefs, if you can imagine it, are quite far away. and we don't enact them within our motivation quite often. Well, we do, but not as much as the other two. So we're getting further away now. I just want to make that point. So that's values and beliefs. And the next one I want to talk about, which is really the last one in this kind of section, is our goals, our plans. So we can see here, this is very, very far away. And our values and our beliefs are great influencers. And I should put an arrow from values and beliefs as an influencer on goals and plans, really, as well as an influencer on our motivation. So it's very much our goals and plans are, we can't do it now, so we store it up for the future. So our plans are these self-conscious, so conscious now. And the same with values and beliefs. They are both conscious things that we do. Wants and needs are, the desire for pleasure and satisfaction are really, I don't know whether it's the word subconscious or unconscious. But these two, values and beliefs and goals and plans, come from our conscious mind. So our plans are our self-conscious and conscious intentions to enact or not enact the response. They're behaviors under certain conditions is another way to do it. And just it's worth noting that plans are generated by other plans, by other evaluations, which are your values and beliefs, and by internal environment, etc., and external environment as well. These are, one of the different parts of this is things like our life intentions. So examples would be things, I'm going to work at 9, I'm going to become a vegetarian, I'm going to go to the pub on Friday, I'm going to get a new job, I'm going to marry my partner. And again, just to reiterate that the diagram shows how far away they are from motivation, and then from the outcome of motivation, which is our behaviors. So again, like values and belief, they will influence our motivation if they're enacted or activated at the right time. So there is one subclass here that I want to talk about, which is this idea of personal rules, things you do and that you don't do. And it kind of links really to self, really, the identity. These are the things I do. These comprise like the trigger, the response, and I do not drink coffee after 3 o'clock. This is a personal rule. Well, not mine, but this is quite a common personal rule. So it's worth noting. So we have goals and plans, and then we have, within there, like in the others, we have this subclass called personal rules. So the simple takeaway from this is I've moved goals and plans over very far to the left, very far away from motivation, with goals and plans and values and beliefs. And very, very close then, we have these wants and needs. And I've also inserted habits. And we talked about habits a minute ago, habits underneath impulses and inhibitions. But habits are very, very important parts, and so much so for me. And we within Sprint Living focus so much on habits that I put it inside here to say that these are great influencers on motivation. Now remember, a habit, habitual ways of living are at least 40%, half of all the time we are in a habitual mode. And what I want to do now is I want to talk about, this is my own theory of motivation based on this slide here. And if you could for a second, Dave's theory of motivation or Sprint Living theory of motivation, I want to make this very, very simple. We've talked about the 4 or 5 different influencers on our motivation and how the motivation, is our processor for what we do next, our behaviors. So let me paint the picture for you for a second to kind of, this is my view on it. Imagine that you have a whiteboard with a set of Post-it notes on it, and one for each of the choice of a behavior and action response that I'm going to make. I'm going to make a cuppa, I'm going to recoil from a dog, go to the toilet, make love, get a new job, climb Everest. So each one of these has their own Post-it note in our brain, and the brain is the whiteboard, and all these Post-its are on the whiteboard. And your brain is continually prioritizing what to do next. And I could say that the brain is there, but I will use the word our motivation is continually, is the processor that is continually processing and prioritizing what to do next. And what's important is that there are criteria. We all individually within our brain have these criteria that we prioritize with. 1 second, let me just look at the clock. Okay. So let's say you have a score of 1 to 100, like we said earlier, for each item. So every Post-it note, you've given a score. 100 at the top of the board. If it reaches, if it's at 100, that'll be the next behavior that you do. I will take the dog for a walk. I will recoil from the snake. And 1 is at the bottom. So if something is a score of 1 or very low, there is no chance that you're going to do it next. And it's constantly changing, continually, moment to moment. You want food, was 95 a couple of minutes ago, then you had a biscuit, now it's 72. I've got a new job, so the life intention for my career goes from 79 to 22. And as I said, impulses and inhibitions are always a high number, always in the 90s. And I'm making up these numbers now, but I'm just trying to give you an idea. Wants and needs are always in the 70s. But your values and the plans are much lower. These are kind of 10, 20. I want to spend more time with my son, always loses out to this impulse to check my email because it's a habit. But these are the most important things to you as a conscious person. So how do we tip the scale? A little bit the other way. How do we increase the number of values and plans, values and beliefs and goals and plans that get prioritized by being higher on the list? This is what we want to do all the time. We want to spend less time on our impulses and inhibitions, on our habits, on our wants and needs. We want to spend more time on our goals and plans and our values and beliefs. And as I said, they're really far away. So how do we get them from 10 to 20, a score of 10 to 20 higher up? And this is core to what we're trying to do in Sprint Living. And this is core to this whole deck, really, to this whole webinar, is that the question we have to ask ourselves is, if this is the model of how our brain works, how we're motivated, how our behaviors happen, then how do we take the goals and plans, values and beliefs, which are really, really far away, and how do we help them to control them, to put them inside there in our moment-to-moment behaviors? True motivation. Okay, so that is the core of this. And let me just go to I think it's the last slide, actually. And so I think the point with this one is that this is what we try to do with Sprint Living. The first thing is that we want to better understand our plans and our intentions. We want to better understand our life intentions, that is. Everything like that. We want to make sure that we understand what they are. Because if we've got very vague plans about the future, about what we want, then the bottom line is that they won't be put into the mix for motivation. They won't get a high score, and you won't enact the behaviors that you want to achieve them. And as I said before, plans are built on other plans and other evaluations. So one massive plan to have a great career is built on sub plans and minor plans within that, child plans with child plans, etc., etc. So the first thing we want to do is understand what our plans are in order to give them a higher score. The second thing is that with our values and principles, we want to understand what they are and what the priority of each of those is. And I work a lot with my clients, and one of the things we find out is, number one, is that their plans are vague, their life intentions are vague. The second thing is that their values and principles, we have a first cut of it at the very beginning. We find out that basically, yes, they are values and principles, but they're not the highest ones that they have. The ones that they believe are important end up not being as important to them as they think. But what we want to do is not to tell them to change these. We want to give it some thought. And then we want to continuously improve these values and principles and our plans with our values and principles by understanding them more, by looking at them more, by doing research on them more and communication. These will change, and we want them to continuously improve. So these activities will bring them to the fore and help them to compete in the motivation CPU, whatever process that we want to call it, to give them a higher number, so then that the behavior gets enacted. And so the next thing that we want to do is that we want to understand motivation and our ability to influence that, which is what we're doing now. We also want to understand habits and work to implement them more, to work to implement more beneficial habits, while aiming to halt the ones that aren't beneficial for us. So we work on our plans and intentions, we work on our values and principles, but we also work on our habits to understand them, how they work. And I have webinars on this, and I talk with my clients on this, and we work on this. And then we want to understand our habits. We also want to start to evolve them. And then the core to that is to actively work on actions, these actions above, that will improve our well-being. And that's fundamentally what we're trying to do with Sprint Living. And this model that I've been going through today in terms of how we motivate ourselves is core. Understanding the model and understand how we can influence our motivation is core to what we do next. So let me come back to the chat here. Let me come back to, I'll quit the slide. Let me come back to it. I'll stop presenting. And yeah, so I'm going to go to Q&A now, but just to kind of reiterate that the whole key to the Sprint Living process, and it is a process, it is a framework, is designed to help us to motivate, to understand our motivations better, to understand our mind better, so we can better influence our behaviors. So let me get started with Q&A. And yeah, let me get started with that now. I'm going to just open up the chat and start looking at that.